The title of the message tonight is Evolution, Creation, Theistic Evolution. As Pastor mentioned, I am an MD, which means mentally deficient, as you know. And I'm a former evolutionist, former atheist, until it's been about 15 years ago. I was a graduate of the UCSD School of Medicine, 1984, and remember in my medical school years in anatomy, holding every organ in the human body in my hand and thinking, wow, billions and billions of years of random molecular collisions produced this incredible thing here. And I believed it. And after graduating from my medical training, I had some significant, you might say, pain allowed into my life. A Christian nurse and some Christian doctors encouraged me to search the evidence for creation. I remember this one physician said to me, he said, Mark, I don't know, he was a Christian, he said, I don't know what it is you need, but I know that if you pray, God will show you the evidence that you need. And so I sat one day on my front lawn in a plastic chair, looked up in the heavens, and I said, if you're up there, God, I need evidence. I can't take this whole thing on faith. I need evidence. And so gradually, slowly, the Lord began showing me the evidence that I needed to come to a belief that there was a God. Probably the most powerful thing that happened was I had been given a 2-part series by Dr. A.E. Wilder-Smith, who had spoken here in 1982 at the invitation of Pastor Chuck. I was $150,000 in debt for my 11-year scientific education. The foundation of my education was the theory of evolution. And I took that 50-cent plastic cassette tape and I stuck it inside that tape player, side A, tape 1, and I hit play. And before I flipped that sucker over to side B, Dr. Wilder-Smith had wiped out the foundation of my $150,000 scientific education with a 50-cent plastic cassette tape. So, and we're actually going to look at the very things that convinced me, some of those things tonight. And so I began studying and trying to, just learn about the evidence, and I became, just fantastically interested in studying the evidence for creation and ultimately the evidence for Christianity. Tonight we're going to look at the issue of the origin of life and the origin of complex systems. And we're going to set some groundwork first to make some definitions so we understand what we're talking about and where we're going. There's a lot of confusion about the idea of evolution, and so I'm going to define the terms here. Creation, the idea of creation, is the idea that life on earth, and in fact the entire universe, was a deliberate, planned, directed, intelligent being who is a supernatural being, a theistic creation, a supernatural event called special creation. It is an event which happened in the past. It's not repeatable, it's not observable, and it must be taken by faith. The idea of evolution, popularized by Charles Darwin in his book in 1859 on the origin of species. The idea of evolution, when I speak about evolution, I'm talking about the materialistic form of evolution, which teaches in effect that there is no God, that all of life on earth, and in fact the entire universe, is the result of non-mind, non-intent, non-plan. The origin of the universe was a cosmic explosion. Billions of years ago, the earth cooled off, the oceans formed, and non-living chemicals came together by undirected stochastic, that is chance chemistry, over hundreds of millions of years to form the first self-replicating molecules, which ultimately were absorbed into the first self-replicating cells. So evolution is materialistic, that is, it is a worldview which teaches that the physical universe, the material universe, is all there is, and that life, that the universe and the life forms on planet Earth are the result of undirected, mechanistic, non-theistic natural forces, the random combining and uncombining of molecules over billions and billions of years. Pick up any journal such as Scientific American. Watch any show on evolution on, say, the Discovery Channel or public television. You'll hear it said over and over again that evolution is a fact. That the non-materialistic, atheistic, or the materialistic, atheistic, undirected worldview of how we got here is a fact. It is a scientific fact. Well, according to Webster's Collegiate Dictionary in 2000, science is the collection of data through observation, the formulation of a hypothesis, and the retesting to confirm or nullify the hypothesis. So science is about observation. So in order for something to be a scientific fact, it has to be observable, repeatable, and it has to be able to be tested to determine if you can confirm it or nullify it. A scientific theory must be restricted to observation of properties, processes, or events that are presently occurring repeatedly within our observations. A scientific theory must be capable of being tested by experiment or further observations, and it must be capable of being falsified if indeed it is wrong. Those are the requirements for a scientific theory. Theories about origins, whether we're talking about the creation theory or the intelligent design theory or the evolutionary theory, are actually non-scientific theories. There were no human observers to the origin of the universe. There were no human observers to the origin of life or the origin of any single living thing. They are historical events that occurred in the past. Creation and evolution are theories about history. They are theories about history and not scientific theories, because you can't repeat the creation event. You can't go back and do experiments back in time on the events that occurred. Such theories, creation and evolution, are inferences based on circumstantial evidence. Paul Ehrlich and L.C. Birch, in Evolutionary History and Population Biology, writing in Nature, that's the name of the article, Nature, volume 214, page 349, said this: "Our theory of evolution has become one which cannot be refuted by any possible observations. Every conceivable observation can be fitted into it. It is thus outside of empirical science, but not necessarily false. No one can think of ways in which to test it." So the theory of evolution cannot be refuted by observations. It's not testable, according to this gentleman. So, since the theory of evolution and the theory of creation are historical events that occurred in the distant past, we are only allowed to extrapolate backwards based on an understanding of the world as we know it now. We need to look at the nature of chemistry, the nature of physics, the nature of mathematics, the nature of science now, couple that with an examination of the nature of the things that are made, the life forms on planet Earth, and make extrapolations in the past about what is the more plausible, the more likely explanation for how we got here. The intelligent design formula says that matter plus energy plus information, know-how, biochemical expertise, blueprints, if you will, were applied to matter and energy in order to produce life. A deliberate, intelligent, directed, purposeful act by an intelligent being applied biochemical know-how to matter in order to create living systems. The evolutionary formula says that matter plus energy plus chance chemistry. For you chemists, if you don't like the word chance, how about stochastic chemistry, which means undirected, unmanipulated chemistry. Chemistry which is not directed or driven by an intelligent being to try to optimize the chemical conditions. Stochastic or chance chemistry plus matter plus energy is what was required to produce life. So two very different views. One view says that it is the result, life is the result of know-how, information. design. The other worldview says that life is the result of non-design, non-thought, chance, or if you will, stochastic processes for you students and scientists. What we can do in order to determine which of these worldviews is the most likely is look at the principles of science and look at the nature of living systems and make a statement about the plausibility of which worldview is the more likely of the two. And so to do that, we need to look first at the nature of living systems. Living systems are self-reproducing systems which are able to store and retrieve information. That is, systems which are able to store the necessary information within inside their structure that allows them to control the reproduction and duplication of themselves, as well as information that codes for the maintenance of the organism. So ability to store and retrieve information is absolutely essential, which is tied to ability to self-reproduce. That is, to make copies of oneself without outside assistance. But in order for a living system to survive and to make copies of itself and for the species to stay viable, there has to be an error correction process. Because in the duplication of information, errors are going to occur. And if there's no error correction process, the species would die out within a matter of maybe a few dozen generations. So an error correction process in the process of retrieving or storing the information is absolutely essential, according to biologists. Next, living systems must be able to extract energy from the environment in order to finance the chemical reactions, the metabolism, and the reproduction that goes on in living systems. Extracting energy from the environment and using that energy to perform work, that is the work of metabolism, the work of reproduction, the work of maintaining the cell, means that the cell has, in effect, machine-like behavior. And we'll talk about that as we go on. Living systems, to be a self-reproducing, self-sustaining living system, requires a cell membrane. Now, viruses can technically be described as a living system, but a virus is a collection of DNA or RNA, we'll talk about, that is a parasite that uses the host's cell's reproductive systems to make copies of itself. To have a free living system, it needs a cell membrane. It needs a membrane that's going to hold all the stuff in to keep it from oozing out into the environment. And finally, there needs to be a waste removal and a nutrient capturing system. And this is accomplished in cells by extremely sophisticated pumps that are channels that traverse the cell membrane. Let's first talk about the cellular hardware. A little bit more about the hardware. I refer to the cell as being made of hardware, which is the molecules themselves, and software, which is the information that is carried within the cell. The DNA molecule, deoxyribonucleic acid, is a fantastically complicated molecule, the structure of which was deciphered in 1953 by these two gentlemen, James Watson and Francis Crick. They ultimately won the Nobel Prize for their discovery in biology. But as you know, the DNA molecule didn't really become famous until 1994 by O.J. Simpson, of course. The DNA molecule consists of two long strands of building blocks called nucleotides. Nucleotides, the building blocks of DNA, consist of a sugar base called deoxyribose, and that's bonded to adenine, thymine, cytosine, and guanine, the four substituents that are bonded to the deoxyribose sugar molecule. These building blocks of DNA are bonded end to end in enormously long chains. Two of these long chains of nucleotides are then connected together. The human genome has 6 billion nucleotides, roughly. An E. coli bacteria has about 3 million nucleotides, and two chains of nucleotides, building blocks, are connected together side by side like a ladder that's been twisted on itself, held together with what are called hydrogen bonds. The DNA molecule carries the instruction to produce all of the structures and control all of the functions in all living systems, except for, as I mentioned, a few viruses which use RNA, ribonucleic acid. The DNA molecule is compacted in to units called chromosomes. Chromosomes are packets of DNA consisting of tens of millions or hundreds of millions of nucleotides. The human being gets 23 chromosomes from the mother and 23 from the father, giving you a total of 46 chromosome packets. In order to make a copy of a DNA molecule, which is absolutely essential for an organism to make a copy of itself, there are approximately 20 protein enzymes that are required to copy a DNA molecule. DNA is copied very rapidly. I read one paper that suggested that a DNA molecule, which can be copied in 20 minutes, the entire genetic code can be copied in 20 minutes, that literally tens of thousands of nucleotide bases are duplicated every few seconds in living cells. So to make DNA, to copy DNA requires about 20 different proteins to make to go from the DNA parent molecule to the two daughter molecules. Approximately 20 protein enzymes. The information on the DNA molecule is extracted by a very complicated process and carried to the RNA molecule inside the cell. And then the RNA molecule then codes for the production of the proteins. So the information to make proteins is stored on the DNA molecule. Those 20 proteins that are required to make DNA, the information to make those proteins is stored on the DNA molecule. And so right away you can see a problem. To copy DNA requires proteins, but to make proteins requires DNA. Without proteins, you can't copy DNA. And so it becomes a chicken or egg scenario. What came first, the proteins or the DNA? We'll talk about that as we go on a little bit. That's a very complicated process. This is a fertilized human ovum. A fertilized human egg is about the size of a pinhead. It contains enough information, bits of information, letters, if you will, of the genetic code, to fill 1,000 books, 500 pages thick, with print so small you need a microscope to read it. If you were to print out all of the letters in the human genome in a Times Roman size 12 font on paper, one gentleman calculated that it would print so many books that you could fill the Grand Canyon 50 times with the books that you would print. It's an enormous, enormous amount of information. That's if you printed all of the information on all of the DNA molecules in the entire human body. All 100 trillion cells printed in books would fill the Grand Canyon 50 times. So where did this come from? Where did this enormously complicated information storage molecule come from? Well, the evolutionists teach in virtually every university, secular university in our country, something called spontaneous generation. It's the idea that life arose from non-living matter. The idea of spontaneous generation has actually been around for thousands of years. It was first proposed by the Greek philosopher in the 6th century BC, Anaximander, who believed that mud spontaneously evolved into microorganisms, which evolved into human beings. In the Middle Ages, people believed in spontaneous generation in a different way. They believed that microbes arose from broths because they noticed if you left soup sitting around after a few days, there'd be critters growing on the surface. They believed that rats arose from trash because they noticed if you put the trash out in the back alley, after a few days there were rats in the trash, and so rats came from trash. And they believed that fruit flies spontaneously arose from aging fruit because if you leave fruit around, it gets flies on it. And so that's an older form of spontaneous generation. Well, that was disproved in the 1800s by Louis Pasteur, who did a series of experiments where he showed that broths of chemicals, nutrients, if they were heated and protected from the outside air, they would remain sterile and no organisms would ever show up. Well, Charles Darwin in 1859 also believed in spontaneous generation. In his book, Origin of Species, he said this: "It is often said that all the conditions for the first production of a living organism are now present, which could ever be present. But if we could conceive in some warm little pond with all sorts of ammonia and phosphoric salts, light, heat, electricity, etc., present, that a protein compound was chemically formed, ready to undergo still more complex changes." So Darwin envisioned a primordial soup scenario with lots of different ammonias and salts and other chemicals that combined randomly to produce the first protein, and ultimately those proteins became complex enough to be in living systems. Many decades later, the Russian biochemist Oparin proposed that life had arisen from simpler molecules on the lifeless Earth under much different atmospheric conditions than exist today. He proposed that spontaneous generation, that is, non-living chemicals becoming living, had occurred gradually over a period of millions of years. Now, the reason he proposed that the conditions were very different in the past is because the oxygen that we breathe, our atmosphere is made of 21% oxygen, the atmosphere that we breathe is destructive to the building blocks of proteins, which are amino acids, and the building blocks of DNA, the nucleotides. And he knew as a chemist that oxygen could not be present on the early Earth because the oxygen would damage the molecules and ultimately prevent them from forming chains like the DNA, which was yet to be discovered some many years later, but certainly would prevent the formation of proteins as well. In 1929, the English biologist J.B.S. Haldane proposed that ultraviolet light acting on a primitive atmosphere containing water, ammonia, methane, produced oceans with a consistency of a hot, dilute soup containing all the necessary building blocks of life. And so they envisioned for decades the idea of a lifeless Earth that had an atmosphere filled with methane, ammonia, water vapor, hydrogen, maybe a little bit of carbon dioxide, but very little, if no, oxygen. Energy from the sun, energy from lightning bolts, energy from geothermal vents, energy from a lot of different sources was used to combine these non-living chemicals to produce the building blocks of life, and the building blocks of life then combined to produce larger molecules. Those larger molecules then combined ultimately to produce the first cells. Well, this theory was put to the test in 1953 by Stanley Miller, who was a graduate student at the University of Chicago. Working under Harold Urey, he simulated the presumed conditions of the early atmosphere. He created a system of glass flasks. The glass flasks were sealed. He had a large flask in the upper right there that had 2 tungsten electrodes. He put the ammonia, the methane, the water vapor into this glass series of flasks, and he circulated the gases through, and then he sparked them for about a week. The first time he did it, he analyzed the material that would gathered in the bottom of his system there in the amino acid trap. First time he analyzed the chemicals, he found no molecules produced that were relevant to life. So, using his graduate school knowledge of chemistry, he tweaked the conditions, he adjusted the amount of ammonia and methane and water vapor, did the experiment again, and lo and behold, he produced some of the building blocks of life. He was declared to be a genius, a hero. Well, what did he actually produce? Well, 85% of what he produced was tar. Tar is basically trillions of carbon atoms bonded together. It's the stuff that they make the streets out of. 85% of what he made was tar. 13% of what he made were called carboxylic acids that are irrelevant to life, not found in living systems. He made 1.05% glycine, which is an amino acid found in living cells, and he made 0.85% alanine, and he made trace amounts of aspartic acid, glutamic acid, beta-alanine, and other amino acids. Stanley Miller won the Nobel Prize for this experiment. He was declared to be the man who proved that chance chemistry, acting on simple molecules, could produce the building blocks of life by chance. And if the building blocks of life can be produced, why not the whole house? If you can make the bricks by chance, why can't you make the whole house, living systems? And so generations of biology students, myself included, were taught this experiment and taught that it's proof that chance chemistry applied to matter using energy could produce the building blocks of life and possibly ultimately life itself. But did he use chance? No. He used a PhD, actually 2 PhDs in biochemistry. So what he did was he proved that in order to make the building blocks of life, you have to use matter plus information plus energy plus information. Biochemical expertise is what he used. So he didn't prove the evolutionary formula, he proved the creation formula. It takes a biochemist with information, knowledge, applying it to matter, using energy to produce the building blocks of life. He doesn't like that when people point it out to him, but that's what he did. Now, Robert Shapiro, a chemist from New York University, wrote a book called Origins, A Skeptic's Guide to the Creation of Life on Earth in 1986. Robert Shapiro analyzed all of the literature up to that point that had been done, peoples that had tried to repeat and modify the Miller experiment. Many different people have tried to create the building blocks of life using sound waves, light, heat, many different sources. And Robert Shapiro reviewed this literature, and he said this. He said, let us sum up. The experiment performed by Miller yielded tar as its most abundant product. There are about 50 small organic compounds that are called building blocks. Only 2 of these 50 occurred among the preferential Miller-Urey products. He goes on. When I was in medical school at the University of California, San Diego School of Medicine in 1980, in my biochemistry class, I was told by my professors, and it said it in my biochemistry book, that the building blocks of DNA, nucleotides, had been produced by spark and soup type experiments. And I believed it. Well, he reviewed the literature. Shapiro did and said this. He said the nucleotides of DNA and RNA have never been reported in any amount in such sources, meaning spark and soup type sources. Yet a mythology has emerged that maintains the opposite. I have seen several statements in scientific sources which claim that proteins and nucleic acids, the nucleotides themselves, have been prepared. These errors reflect the operation of an entire belief system. The facts do not support this belief. Such thoughts may be comforting, but they run far ahead of any experimental validation. To this very day, spark and soup type experiments have never been able to produce the DNA, RNA, building blocks, the nucleotides. Robert Shapiro, Origins, 1986, page 108 and 109. So even the building blocks of the DNA molecule using biochemical know-how have not been produced today. In fact, biochemists will confirm to you today that using the best biochemical expertise applied to matter using slave labor graduate students and supercomputers and vast sums of money, that they today cannot create a DNA molecule using the best biochemical expertise and the elements of the ground and the presumed conditions that existed on the early Earth. There are many problems with the Miller-Urey experiment, some of which we'll look at tonight. First of all, there is no geochemical evidence for the primordial soup. There's no evidence that a primordial soup ever existed. Michael Denton, a molecular biologist who wrote a book called Evolution, a Theory in Crisis. He is an evolutionist, he is not a creationist. On page 261 of his book said, considering the way the prebiotic soup is referred to in so many discussions of the origin of life as an already established reality, it comes as something of a shock to realize that there is absolutely no positive evidence for its existence. None. There's no evidence for a primordial soup. Secondly, recent evidence shows that there was abundant oxygen on the early Earth, in the early atmosphere. Very, very ancient, very deep, the deepest rocks that they have dug into have evidence of oxygen. They believe they're billions of years old. I don't. Molecular biologist Michael Denton, again, Evolution of Theory in Crisis, page 261, says, ominously, for believers in the traditional organic soup scenario, there is no clear geochemical evidence to exclude the possibility that oxygen was present in the Earth's atmosphere soon after the formation of the crust. It turns out that if you read the literature today, they've got a real problem. There was a tremendous amount of oxygen on the early Earth. The problem is even worse because there's a catch-22 situation. If there's oxygen on the early Earth, the oxygen will damage the building blocks of life, the nucleotides or the amino acids that are the building blocks of protein, preventing them from forming the molecules necessary to make life. So if there's oxygen on the early Earth, it prevents spontaneous generation. But if there's no oxygen on the Earth, then you also cannot have an ozone layer. And the ozone layer protects the Earth from extremely harmful radiation from the sun, that if there's no ozone layer, those rays will get to the Earth, strike the primordial soup, and guess what they do? They break down the building blocks of life. And so it's a catch-22. The next problem for the idea of spontaneous generation and the spark and soup experiments is something called the law of mass action. It's a very simple law in chemistry that says that a chemical reaction that can go in both directions, two chemicals react with each other, chemical A and B react to produce chemical C and D, and then chemical C and D react to go back to produce chemical A and B. That's a reversible chemical reaction. That a reversible chemical reaction will never go in the direction to produce something which already exists in excess. Now, according to the spark and soup theory, the main thing in the primordial soup was water. But the problem is this: when you combine an amino acid, the simplest building block of a protein, with another amino acid to produce a small protein called a dipeptide, it produces a molecule of water. A molecule of water is created in that process. When you bond a nucleotide to a nucleotide, it produces a dinucleotide, the beginning stages of a DNA molecule. It produces a molecule of water. So this equation produces water. In order to create a lengthening chain of these molecules, you're going to generate a tremendous amount of water. And the law of mass action says that will not happen, because you're not going to produce something which already exists in excess. Now, for you chemists in the audience, I recognize there's a way around this, and that is to remove the solution out of equilibrium, and the way you do that is with a catalyst, such as an enzyme. But there were no catalysts. There were no enzyme catalysts at that time. That's a little footnote for you chemists. Another problem with the Miller-Urey experiment is that amino acids, the building blocks of protein, and nucleotides, the building blocks of DNA and RNA, bond to the chemical junk made by Stanley Miller far more readily than they bond to themselves. So you've got all this tar and these carboxylic acids and all these chemicals there in this slurry. They bond far more readily, and they don't let go very easily to the building blocks of life. And finally, and you're going to love this one, you know the material that Miller and Urey produced? Those carboxylic acids, they're enzyme poisons. They're poisonous. If Stanley Miller were to have drank the slurry that he made, he would have been dead in 6 minutes, and he would have never picked up his Nobel Prize. And so they want us to believe that an environment with these poisonous carboxylic acids and other chemicals that are produced, these poisons, they're poisons because they bind to enzymes, and enzymes are the chemicals that accomplish your chemical reactions. They want us to believe that that's where life arose. It's absurd. Next, the building blocks of life, the DNA building blocks, nucleotides, and the building blocks of proteins, the amino acids, occur in two forms. And this is one of the nuggets that I heard A.E. Wilder-Smith share 15 years ago that just gave me that, oh my, experience. This is one of those little nuggets that helped me see that there had to be a creator. This is a illustration of an amino acid. It consists of a carbon atom that has 4 substances bonded to it. And whenever you have a carbon atom that's bonded to 4 different substances, that kind of a molecule comes in two forms. It comes in a left-handed form and a right-handed form, and they are mirror images of each other. This is called molecular chirality. These types of amino acids and the building blocks of life occur in mirror image forms. Well, there's a problem. The proteins in all living systems, except for a few examples that I'll mention, are made of exclusively 100% left, that is levo, amino acids. The building blocks of RNA and DNA are made of 100% right-handed, or they're called dextronucleotides. Now, the exceptions to this in the amino acids are things like enzyme poisons. The right-handed amino acids are enzyme poisons such as strychnine and others. So in living systems, we've got 100% left-handed amino acids and 100% right-handed nucleotides. Now, to produce a protein, proteins are built by adding one amino acid at a time to an ever-lengthening chain. The same thing with nucleotides. One nucleotide bonded together, creating an ever-lengthening chain. And here's the problem. When Stanley Miller did his spark and soup experiment, and every person that's repeated it in the last almost 50 years, they produced a soup consisting of 50% right and 50% left-handed building blocks. It's called a racemic mixture for you students. Always occurs. Roughly 50% left-handed and 50% right-handed amino acids. Now, so you imagine your primordial soup. You've got trillions and trillions of these amino acids and trillions of these nucleotides, the building blocks of life. Life is just waiting to evolve. But there's a problem. There's no mind that's directing it. And so if you imagine how a protein is made, it's made by combining an amino acid to an amino acid to another amino acid. Every time you, in effect, reach into the primordial soup and chemistry, undirected chemistry, binds another amino acid to the protein, it's roughly a 50-50 chance that a left-handed amino acid or a right-handed amino acid is going to be taken out of the soup and combined onto the ever-lengthening chain. So the kind of proteins you're going to get are proteins which, from this kind of chance chemistry, are proteins which have 50% left-handed and 50% right-handed amino acids. The same with nucleotides. These are called racemates or racemic proteins. And this is absolutely destructive to living systems. Living systems require exclusively left-handed amino acids in order for the proteins to fold properly to create the structures like insulin, like hemoglobin, and other important proteins. Sticking right-handed amino acids into the chain of amino acids destroys the structure by damaging the folding, the three-dimensional folding of a protein, thereby destroying its ability to function. So how did that primordial soup with 50% left-handed and 50% right-handed building blocks ever evolve into living systems with 100% left-handed amino acids and 100% right-handed nucleotides? Well, they say it happened by chance. But 50 years of chemistry, 50 years of biochemistry and seminars and symposiums on this problem have shown that chance will never create pure amino acids, left-handed, or pure nucleotides, right-handed. Chance chemistry will never produce or separate the right-handed and left-handed building blocks. There is a way to separate them. It's called biochemical expertise. The only known way to separate the amino acids, the right and left-handed amino acids, or the right and left-handed building blocks, is to apply know-how, biochemical expertise to the problem. And biochemical expertise only comes from a mind. Biochemist William Bonner, in his book Origin and Amplifications of Biomolecular Chirality, there's an interesting book to read by the fire at night, huh? He said this. He said, the basis for the origin of bimolecular chirality still remains obscure. Dos Klaus, in The Origin of Life, More Questions Than Answers, in Interdisciplinary Science Reviews, Volume 13, Number 4, page 348 to 356, He's the director of the Institute for Biochemistry at Johannes Gutenberg University in West Germany. He said this: "In spite of many attempts, there have been no breakthroughs during the past 30 years to help explain the origin of chirality in living cells." He means by chance. 30 years of research up to 1988, they've never figured out how chance can cause the primordial soup, which has 50% left and right-handed building blocks, to turn into pure proteins and pure amino acids. And so these problems are devastating. The origin of the hardware, the only way you can create that is known by man to produce optically pure, for you students, left-handed amino acids and right-handed building blocks, is with the application of biochemical know-how, expertise. Let's talk now about the origin of the software. The software is what I refer to the genetic code. The genetic code is the information system, the language convention, the language system that is used by living systems for the storage and retrieval of information off of the DNA molecule. First of all, the genetic code is digital. That is, it's expressible in discrete mathematical terms. Next, the genetic code is error correcting. That is, there are about 6 levels of error correction that I'm aware of, so that when a DNA molecule makes a copy of itself, there are 6 levels of error correction that correct any misplaced building blocks. So it's an error correcting digital code. Next, the genetic code is redundant. There are segments of DNA that are so important that 2 or 3 genes, these segments of DNA, are found as backup copies. If a primary copy of a gene is damaged, that gene will be turned off and a backup copy can be turned on, so it's redundant. The next is the information is overlapping. There are segments of DNA that can code for the production of more than one protein, thereby segments of DNA that can code for the controlling of more than one function in the body. Imagine an English sentence, 100 letters long, that you write, and you put spaces in between the letters, and it spells out, "Jack and Jill went up the hill to fetch a pail of water," on out for 100 letters. You leave the letters in the same sequence, you squish them together, and you put spaces in a different place, and maybe start reading a few letters down. And this time it spells, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." John 1:1, and it goes out on for 100 letters. Same sequence of letters, spelling 2 entirely different sentences. That's a little hint of the nature of the DNA code. Next, the information is semantic. That is, the language convention used by the genetic code, which is the language convention used by the DNA molecule, possesses grammar, syntax, and punctuation. The cell says, start reading at nucleotide number 1, go down to number nucleotide 141, then go over to number 242 and read to 365 and pull the 2 pieces together. There's grammar, syntax, and punctuation. Start and stop bits, instructions. Incredible. Incredible structure. Now let's talk about the origin of such information. Where does a digital, error-correcting, redundant, overlapping semantic code come from? Well, first of all, let's talk about the nature of information. When we look at the shape of letters in a book, the shape of iron atoms on a floppy disk, or the molecules of DNA, or any substance that you're using to carry information, the shape and the structure of those chemicals does not possess any intrinsic information. However, letters in a book, iron atoms on a floppy disk, molecules of DNA, knots on a rope, beads on a string, can carry meaning when used with a pre-existing language system. So in order for information to be conveyed, there must be a language system that is used to interpret the sequences. The meaning of a sequence of letters, beads on a string, knots on a rope, the sounds of one voice, or any storage system is determined by such pre-existing language conventions. The only way that the noises that I'm making possess meaning is they are interpreted by a language convention that says a certain sound possesses a certain meaning. The sounds themselves do not possess intrinsic information unless there's a language convention used to interpret them. And we'll look more at this as we go on. Where do language conventions come from? Well, any information scientist will tell you that language conventions only come from a mind. In fact, they will tell you that chance is the antipole of information. The thing that differentiates between a 3-year-old tapping at a keyboard blindly and, say, the writing of a computer code is the elimination of chance. It is the elimination of chance, according to computer scientists, that results in the production of information. Chance, they will tell you, information scientists, is the thermodynamic antipole, meaning the 180-degree opposite of information. Language conventions are always the result of a mind, according to information scientists, and mind means intelligence. Let's say you and I want to invent a new language convention. We're going to make a new language that we want to use to secretly communicate to each other. And we decide that ugh means I'll meet you at the malt shop. I heard this from Pastor Chuck, by the way. And we decide that nug means okay, I'll meet you there. And then we decide that lug means I'm buying. And we're in a big building like this, and I stand up over here to the side and I say, ugh. Now everybody in the room thinks that I'm choking or insane perhaps, except you in the back. You stand up and you say, nug, we're going to the malt shop, I'll meet you there. And then I say, lug. And you get a big smile on your face and go out the back door. All right, we're going to the malt shop and Mark's buying. And everybody else is going, huh? What's wrong with those knuckleheads? What's the difference? The difference is information is only conveyed when there is an agreement. And it's an arbitrary, that is just randomly decided on agreement, that a certain sequence possesses a certain meaning. A.E. Wildersmith said right here at this very pulpit in 1982, in order to convey information, you need a pattern. I wish I could do the British accent, but I can't, I'm sorry. In order to convey information, you need a pattern upon which you hang meaning. The meaning is arbitrary. Information does not arise by chance. And every information scientist on the planet knows this fact. ... ... ... ... Everybody in the room sees the order. If you take this and show it to anybody in the world, they will see that it is an unlikely pattern, that is unlikely to be the result of taking dots and dashes and throwing it up in the air and having it land. So the ordered arrangement can be seen by everybody. But information is only conveyed when you have a knowledge of something called the Morse code. Some guy named Morse decided, let's make ... equal S, ... equal O, and SOS, save our souls, means help! I got a flat tire. Meaning is only conveyed when you have a pattern that you assign or hang meaning. Gift, G-I-F-T, is a present in English. Anybody here speak German? What does it mean in German? Poison. It's poison. So if I give you a G-I-F-T in America, I'll make you happy. If I give you a G-I-F-T in German, I won't make you happy. I will kill you. So what I'm saying here is that the letters themselves, G-I-F-T, do not possess meaning. Meaning is assigned. That's the nature of information. Information is conveyed when you have a pattern upon which you assign, or as Wildersmith likes to say, you hang meaning. Meaning means intelligence. It means purpose. And meaning only comes from a mind. Dr. John Baumgartner, a geophysicist from Los Alamos National Laboratory, in a symposium, Highlights of the Los Alamos Origins Debate, said this: language involves a symbolic code, a vocabulary, and a set of grammatical rules to relay or record thought. The meaning or message does not depend on whether it is represented as sound waves in the air or as ink patterns on paper, or as alignment of magnetic domains on a floppy disk, or as voltage patterns in a transistor network. The message that a person has won the $100 million lottery is the same whether that person receives the information by someone speaking at his door, or by telephone, or by mail, or on television, or over the internet. Indeed, Einstein pointed to the nature and origin of symbolic information as one of the most profound questions about the world as we know it. He could identify no means by which matter could bestow meaning to symbols. The clear implication is that the symbolic information or language represents a category of reality distinct from matter and energy. The implications are immediate for this issue of evolution. The evolutionary assumption that the exceedingly complex linguistic structures which comprise the construction blueprints and operating manuals for all the complicated chemical nanomachinery, cells, and sophisticated feedback control mechanisms in even the simplest living organism simply must have a materialistic explanation. In other words, the idea that it has a materialistic explanation is fundamentally wrong. But how then does one account for symbolic language as the crucial ingredient from which all living organisms develop and function and manifest such amazing capabilities? The answer should be obvious. An intelligent creator is unmistakably required. Where you see symbolic information, there must be a mind. Chance will never produce symbolic information. Hubert Yockey, who I've had opportunity to converse with, is probably the premier world's authority on information science alive today. He wrote an article, Information Bits and Bytes, Bioessays, volume 17, page 85 in 1995. This man, as far as I know, is not a believer, but he's examined the nature of the genetic code and made some staggering statements. He said this about information: the meaning, if any, of words, that is, a sequence of letters, is arbitrary. It is determined by the natural language and is not a property of the letters or their arrangement. In other words, what he's saying is that letters don't possess meaning. Nucleotides don't possess meaning. Iron atoms on a floppy disk don't possess meaning. The meaning is arbitrary. That means it is assigned. For example, "O singe fort" has no meaning as a sentence in English, although each is an English word. Yet in German, it means "O sing on." And in French, it means "O strong monkey." Like all messages, the life message is non-material but has an information content measurable in bits and bytes. And so, again, like the word gift, meaning is assigned. It is not inherent. So where does information come from? M. Eden, in Inadequacies of Neo-Darwinian Evolution as a Scientific Theory, Mathematical Challenges to the Neo-Darwinian Interpretation of Evolution, Proceedings of the Wistar Institute Press, page 11, said this: "No currently existing formal language can tolerate random changes in the symbolic sequences which express its sentences. Meaning is invariably destroyed." He says that the idea that a code could evolve into another code. You see, if you're going to say that we evolved from primordial bacteria, that we evolved from a single cell bacteria that has, say, 3 million nucleotides like an E. coli. If you're going to evolve an E. coli into a human being which has 6 billion nucleotides, you have to add billions and billions of bits of information over time to the existing code of that bacteria. And he says that random changes, which is what mutations are, that is, random changes in the DNA molecule, are destructive to information. Random changes do not produce information, they invariably destroy information. Werner Gitt, in the beginning was information, Bielefeld, Germany, page 107, said this, and on page 141, he followed up. He said, "All experiences indicate that a thinking being voluntarily exercising his own free will, cognition, and creativity is required, meaning to create information. There is no known law of nature, no known process, and no known sequence of events which can cause information to originate by itself in matter. The sum total of experience of computer science, of information science, tells us that information comes from a person with will, cognition, and creativity. That is, information know-how. Fred Hoyle, an astronomer and mathematician who was knighted by the Queen of England, he is Sir Fred Hoyle, working with Chandra Wickramasinghe and some graduate students back in the late 70s, early 80s, examined the nature of the DNA molecule, the nature of the DNA, and the nature of the information carried by the DNA molecule, and he said this: the notion that not only the biopolymers, that is the DNA and RNA and proteins, but the operating program of a living cell could be arrived at by chance in a primordial soup here on Earth is evidently nonsense of a high order. Quite a few of my astronomical friends are considerable mathematicians. And once they become interested enough to calculate for themselves instead of relying on hearsay argument, they can quickly see this point. Sir Fred Hoyle, New Scientist, Volume 92, page 527. This is the Daily Express in London, Friday, August 14th, 1981. This is Fred Hoyle and Chandra Wickramasinghe. Their conclusion was, looking at the nature of DNA and the nature of information, there must be a God. And Fred Hoyle was an atheist. Chandra Wickramasinghe, in that interview, said, "At the moment, I can't find any rational argument to knock down the view which argues for conversion to God. We used to have an open mind. We now realize that the only logical answer to life is creation and not accidental random shuffling." Chandra Wickramasinghe is professor of applied math and astronomy at University College, Cardiff. If you go to the website www.seti.org, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, you will see that they'll tell you that what they're doing is they're scanning the microwave band of radiation in the sky, looking for signals that's evidence of intelligent beings. What are they looking for? They're looking for non-random, digital, repeating sequences in the microwave band of radiation. If they find such a signal at one of their stations, they notify other stations and try to get it confirmed by other stations around the world. If they find such a signal, they announce to the world, "We have found evidence of intelligent life." Why? Because we found a non-random digital signal which proves that it's intelligence sending us signals from outer space. Folks, the genetic code is the very kind of signal they're looking for. Exactly. If they would just take these telescopes and point them at their DNA molecules and read them, they would see that it came from an intelligence. But yet these same people and this same website say that because life evolved on Earth over billions of years, and because we believe that there's galaxies out there and planets out there that are billions and billions of years older, we believe that life has evolved out there also by chance that's probably more sophisticated than us. Folks, it doesn't make sense. Coded information equals intelligence. That's what they're looking for. Why can't they see that the coded information on the DNA molecule also means intelligence? Let's finish with this. The final attribute of living systems is that living systems are machines. What's the definition of a machine? According to Jacques Monod, Nobel laureate at Harvard University, a machine is a purposeful collection of matter that uses energy to perform work. A collection of matter that uses energy to perform work. It turns out that all the way down to the molecular level, all the way down to the level of the protein enzyme. Enzymes are proteins which accomplish your complicated chemical reactions such as digestion, sight, hearing, taste, touch, thought, muscular contraction, etc. All the way down to the level of the protein enzymes, your body fulfills the definition of a machine. An enzyme is an aggregate of matter that uses energy from protein, fat, and sugar to perform work, the work of biochemical reactions. George Gaylord Simpson said this about living systems. He said, "We have repeatedly emphasized the fundamental problems posed for the biologist by the fact of life's complex organization. We have seen that the organization requires work for its maintenance." So living systems require work. That's what machines do. "And that the universal quest for food is in part to provide the energy needed for this work. But the simple expenditure of energy is not sufficient to develop and maintain order. A bull in a china shop performs work, but he neither creates nor maintains organization. The work needed is particular work in living cells. It must follow specifications. It requires information on how to proceed." So living systems are not only machines, but they're information-driven machines. He said that in Life and Introduction to Biology on page 466. George Gaylord Simpson is a professor of vertebrate paleontology at Harvard University. Michael Denton said this about living cells. He said, "Although the tiniest bacterial cells are incredibly small, weighing less than 10 to the minus 12 grams, each is in effect a veritable micro-miniaturized factory containing thousands of exquisitely designed pieces of intricate molecular machinery, made up altogether of 100,000 million atoms, far more complicated than any machine built by man, and absolutely without parallel in the non-living world." Michael Denton, an evolutionist, in his book Evolution, a Theory in Crisis, page 250, 1986. He says that living cells are machines, and they're far more complicated than any machine built by man. Now, the visual system is made of dozens and dozens of subsystems, all of which run on enzymatic reactions, which are machine-like reactions. The visual system does trillions and trillions of calculations accomplished by enzymes, which are little molecular machines. John Stevens, in his article called "Reverse Engineering the Brain" in Byte magazine, April 1985, page 287, said this: "While today's digital hardware is extremely impressive, it is clear that the human retina's real-time performance goes unchallenged. Actually, to simulate 10 milliseconds, or 1/100th of a second, of the complete processing of even a single nerve cell from the retina would require the solution of about 500 simultaneous nonlinear differential equations 100 times. So 50,000 calculus equations required to simulate what happens in one retinal cell in 1/100th of a second." And he said it would take at least several minutes of processing time on a Cray supercomputer. Keeping in mind that there are 10 million or more such cells interacting with each other in complex ways, it would take a minimum of 100 years of Cray time, calculating time, to simulate what takes place in your eye many times every second. It takes a Cray supercomputer in 1985 100 years to simulate what takes place many times every second in your eyes. No wonder your eyeballs are so tired at the end of the day. You've been doing trillions and trillions of calculus equations with your eyeballs, even if you've never had a class in calculus. Let's talk about bats. Bats are fun little creatures. God's got a great sense of humor. He made bats. Well, bats are nocturnal, and they use a sonar echolocation system where they send out a chirp. The chirp comes back, it's picked up by their ear. The distance that the chirp traveled, the object that it bounced off of, the shape of the object, the size of the object, even the temperature of that object is discerned by how the sound waves bounce back. The sound waves are brought in by the ear, interpreted by their brain supercomputer, and the bat is able to fly around a completely pitch dark room, completely pitch dark, with wires strung throughout the room, and by sending out these chirps can fly in a pitch dark room with wires strung in it without ever hitting the wires. Whoa, that's fantastic echolocation. Alan Grinnell, neuroscientist at UCLA, said this of the bat: Epticecus fuscus, the name of that bat, can process overlapping echoes arriving just 2/millionths of a second apart and distinguish between objects that are just 0.3 millimeters apart. That's tiny. He says that's something which seems intuitively impossible, and yet they do it. And comparing the capability of bat sonar, James Simmons, neuroscientist at Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island, said this, that bats' echolocation is 3 times as sharp as human-made sonar. 3 times as sharp. The bat's sonar is incredible. It is a machine. It's a powerful machine, a supercomputer. This is the IBM ASC White computer. This computer, as of November 2001, is the fastest supercomputer made by man. The IBM ASC White computer has 8,196 processors. It calculates at 12.3 trillion calculations per second. Its weight is 160 tons. It uses a floor space. It took a floor space of 2 basketball courts to set this thing up. The power required to run it is enough electricity to run a small city, and it was transported by 28 tractor-trailer trucks from IBM in New York to the Lawrence Livermore Laboratory in California. And we scientists stand around this machine, like Tom Hanks in the movie Castaway, as he stood there and said, "Look what I have made. I have made fire." We stand there and we say, "Look what I have made. I have made supercomputer." And we're so impressed with ourselves. Well, guess what? This is an ant. An ant has a brain. The ant's brain has 250,000 processors. The ant's brain has a peak calculating capacity of 1.2 trillion cell-to-cell calculations per second. That's when one cell communicates to another cell. Now, inside the actual cells, those 250,000 cells, the intracellular calculations are probably billions of molecular calculations, reactions per second. So the total calculations is billions times trillions of calculations per second in an ant's brain. The ant's brain weighs 1/10,000th of an ounce. The IBM ASC White weighed 160 tons. The ant's brain requires power in nanovolts, which is billions of volts. And the ant's brain can be transported by an ant. It blows away the IBM ASC White. It's incredible. Let's talk about the human brain. The average human brain weighs 3.5 pounds and has the consistency of a meatloaf, roughly. The average human... I read one neurobiologist that said that one human brain has more electrical connections, called synapses, than all of the electrical connections in all of the appliances and all the computers and all the phone systems ever made on planet Earth. The human brain calculates in petaflops, which is billions times billions of floating point operations per second, and that's just the cell-to-cell communication. That doesn't count what happens inside each of the 100 billion brain cells. Meaning the human brain is billions of times faster than any computer built by man. The human brain runs at 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, and it runs on potatoes. Or cheeseburgers, or chimichangas, or whatever. It's a super computer. I read one scientist that said that if we could create a computer that could run as fast as a human brain using our silicone wafer technology, if we made such a computer, built it, it would require the energy used by the city of Las Vegas at nighttime, and it would run so hot it would burn a hole in the ground 50 feet deep. And yet there you sit this evening with your 3.5-pound meatloaf brains, doing petaflops, and your head is not on fire. It's a super water-cooled supercomputer. So what is a cell? A living cell is an information-packed, error-correcting, micro-miniaturized, self-reproducing super machine. 1 million cells can comfortably fit on the head of a pin, an E. coli bacteria, And engineers tell us that miniaturization, that is, engineers' ability to make machines smaller and smaller and smaller, is an evidence of increased intelligence. Increased intelligence manifested as an increased efficiency in the utilization of space and information. So miniaturization means intelligence. So how much intelligence does it take to make an information-packed, error-correcting, micro-miniaturized, self-reproducing machine? A machine that makes copies of itself, 1 million of which can sit comfortably on the head of a pin. And for single-celled organisms to evolve into highly complex multicellular organisms would require the addition of billions of bits of new information. So how do you make a machine? I've had the opportunity about 5 times now to teach on university campuses, and I love doing this because what I do is I talk about the origin of the hardware, the origin of the software, and I talk about the machine-like structure of living systems. And I tell the students, I want you to go to the biology department and ask them, where do these information-packed, micro-miniaturized, self-reproducing, error-correcting, micro-miniaturized machines come from? And the biologists will tell you they arose by chance. I say, I want you to leave the biology department, go over to the engineering department and ask an engineer, where do machines come from? And they will tell you that all machines begin as a concept. A concept of the machine is then applied to a paper to store it, or into a computer nowadays, in a CAD program, a computer-aided design program, and all concepts come from a mind. So according to engineers, the people that know the most about machines, all machines come from a mind. They'll tell you that chance will never produce a machine, especially a machine that makes copies of itself. Never. A few years ago, I heard an ad on the radio for the Sharper Image Turbo 2000 nose hair trimmer. You may have heard of it. You may have heard of it. It's the world's best nose hair trimmer, according to them. And it's a turbo nose hair trimmer. I thought, what do I need a turbo nose hair trimmer for? Wouldn't a regular one be just fine? What if I put it on turbo and take my nose off? Well, where did the Turbo 2000 nose hair trimmer begin? It began in the mind of somebody with way too much time on their hands, obviously. I'm going to invent the world's best nose hair trimmer, that's it. They applied the concept to matter to make the machine. And every engineer will tell you that the chance combining of matter is destructive to machines. Sir Fred Hoyle said in Nature, volume 294, page 105, this: the likelihood of the formation of life from inanimate matter is 1 to a number with 40,000 noughts, that is, zeros after it. 1 chance in 10 to the 40,000th power. It is enough to bury Darwin and the whole theory of evolution. If the beginnings of life were not random, they must therefore have been the product of purposeful intelligence. Hubert Yockey said in Information Theory and Molecular Biology, Cambridge University Press, 1992, page 284, the belief that life on Earth arose spontaneously from non-living matter is simply a matter of faith in strict reductionism and is based entirely on ideology. In other words, it's a belief system. There's no evidence that life could arise by chance. And Sir Fred Hoyle said in Nature, November 12th, 1981, the chance that higher life forms might have emerged this way, that is, by chance, is comparable with the chance that a tornado sweeping through a junkyard could assemble a Boeing 747 from the materials therein. It isn't going to happen. I shared these things with 2 professors at a university in Southern California, and they said to me this. They said, we are scientists. Unless we can see it, touch it, taste it, smell it, or test it, we cannot accept it. And therefore, since I cannot see, taste, touch, smell, hear, or detect your God with scientific instrumentation, I cannot believe that God exists. If I can't see it or test it, I can't believe that it exists. You should love it when you hear that argument, because there are many things that exist that are non-material. Alvin Plantinga, a Christian philosopher, said that proving the existence of God is like proving the existence of someone else's mind. Proving the existence of God is like proving the existence that someone else has a mind. The thing about your mind is it's non-material, non-physical, undetectable by scientific machinery. And so, I looked at the professor and I said, according to the principles of your objection, I'm not permitted to believe that you have a mind. I can't see it, taste it, touch it, smell it, hear it, or detect it. And he said, well, that's ridiculous. I said, I agree. He said, of course I have a mind. I said, I agree. And so it is with God. And so it is with God. You see, you have to ask the question about plausibility. What's more plausible? That an information-packed, micro-miniaturized, self-reproducing, error-correcting machine is the result of a mind or the result of non-mind? And just because we can't see the mind that did it, the mind of God, doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Because I know you exist, and I can't see your mind. I want to tell you about an amazing mountain found in South Dakota. This mountain is the result of billions and billions of years of wind and rain and earthquakes and squirrels burrowing into the hillsides. This mountain is the result of billions and billions of years of random forces of nature. Billions and billions of years of wind and rain and lightning produced this mountain. I call it Mount Chuckmore. Now, what do we see when we look at Mount Chuckmore? We see the concept, which is information, the concept of four faces stored in stone. Do we see the Creator? No. Do we see him hiding behind the rock? No. What do we see? We see the fingerprints of the Creator. We see the concept of the Creator stored in stone. And so we must ask the question about plausibility. What is more plausible? That Mount Chuckmore is the result of wind and rain and lightning and earthquakes and squirrels burrowing into the hillsides? Is that more plausible? Or is it more plausible that it's the result of a concept, the concept of four faces stored in stone? And just because we can't see the mind that created Mount Chuckmore doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I did this in Photoshop. Trust me, I do have a mind. Sometimes it malfunctions, but it's there. And just because we can't see the mind that created the self-reproducing, error-correcting, information-packed machines doesn't mean that it's not there. It's about plausibility, folks. I was at USC last year, and I did a talk similar to this. And after I finished my talk, a professor stood up in the back and he said, "You are a disgrace to science." And I said, "Professor, you have the floor." And he said, "Scientists have proven that there's no God." I said, "They have?" He said, "Yes." He said, "Scientists have found thousands of pieces of information in the last 50 years that have proven there's no God." I said, "Wow." I said, "Professor, you have the floor. Would you share with the students here at USC the evidence that there's no God that scientists have found?" And he said, "Well, there's thousands of pieces of evidence." I said, "Great, we just like one." He wouldn't bite. I said, "Professor, isn't it true that science is the observation of a phenomena, the formation of a hypothesis, and the testing and retesting to either verify or nullify your hypothesis?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Do you have God in a test tube? Because I'd like to meet him if you do." He said, "Well, no, I don't." I said, "Well, could you get him into a test tube for me?" And he said, "No, I can't." I said, "Well, could you do any experiments on God that would be scientific, that would either prove or disprove he exists?" He said, "No, I can't." I said, "Then, Professor, God cannot be proven with science any more than he can be disproven with science. And what I'm doing today is not proving that God exists with science. I'm making statements of plausibility. What we know about the laws of information, the nature of biochemistry, a DNA molecule cannot be synthesized by the best biochemists. Information does not arise by chance, and machines do not arise by chance. What we know about our best information in science tells us that it is far more plausible that an information-packed, micro-miniaturized, error-correcting, self-reproducing machine, which is what a cell is a result of a mind rather than non-mind. And the Bible says that mind, God, made us. He made you and me from dirt. Genesis 2, verse 7. And God made man from the dust of the ground. You're highly complicated, self-reproducing dirt clods. God used dirt and biochemical know-how, plus a little water, stirred and made Mark Eastman. Incredible biochemical know-how. And that same God that made you, gave you capacity of choice, stepped into time and space in the person of Christ and paid off your sin debt. Your debt of sin, your moral iniquities, which were the result of God giving you capacity of choice. Jesus died on the cross, the creator of the universe, of information and machines, who made you and paid off your sin debt. The greatness of God's mind is seen in creation, but the greatness of God's love is seen in redemption. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we praise you and thank you for your word, for your creation, but most of all, for your Son. We thank you, Lord, that you revealed yourself to us in such a mighty way through science, through creation, through the things that are made. And we thank you, Lord, that we can stand boldly in the world of ideas, and we can stand boldly in our classrooms and boldly in our places of business, and that we can show people, indeed, the evidence is overwhelming that life is the result of an intentional, deliberate, creative act of a super intelligence who also is a super God of love, who made us and then died for us to pay off our sin debt. In the name of Jesus, whose name we pray, amen. God bless you.